Thank you, Laura, and thanks to certainly Carolyn Orr and everybody at CSG for putting this together this morning, and thanks to everybody that's participating. I would like to first introduce Dr. Peter Hotez. Dr. Hotez is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine. He's also the director at the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and internationally recognized physician, scientist in vaccine development. After we hear from Dr. Hotez and get our questions to the doctor, we'll be hearing from Matthew Bailey. Matthew is the president of the Foundation for Biomedical Research and the National Association for Biomedical Research. So at this point, I think I will turn it over to Dr. Hotez. And Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Maybe I'll make about 10 minutes of remarks. Does that sound about right? And
That's
answer
great.
questions, however you'd like to proceed. But, you know, this has been obviously a pretty rough winter and fall. I think we could, as a nation, I think we could have done a lot more to stem the surge that occurred over the southern states during the summer, and then now the fall states. And unfortunately, we're now the epicenter in the world in terms of COVID-19, accelerating to 200,000 new cases a day. And remember what that means. That's probably an underestimate by a factor of 4 or 5. So we're looking at, upwards of 1 million cases, new cases a week, which is just astonishing. I never thought we'd get to such a horrible place. And of course, we're at 3,000 deaths per day. So we're at 300,000 American lives lost this week. And by the time, about a week after the inauguration, the projections are at about 400,000 lives lost, which just to put that in perspective, that's the number of Americans, GIs, who lost their lives in World War II. So we're looking something on that historic scale, which again, I never thought we did. And because we never really had a national control program, and the leadership needed to contain COVID-19, we kind of backed ourselves into a corner and are now totally reliant on a biotechnology as a solution, which as a vaccine scientist, even I recognize the deficiencies in that, but that's where we are. We're going to be totally reliant on to vaccinate our way out of this, it looks like. The good news is the vaccines are looking pretty effective. So about a decade ago, a number of us began developing prototype coronavirus vaccines, not so much for COVID-19 because we didn't know about that virus existed, but looking at the original SARS in 2003. So the COVID-19 virus is caused by SARS-2. SARS-1 emerged out of southern China in 2003 and wrecked the economy of Toronto for a while in 2003. And then we had the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, MERS coronavirus in 2012. And that's when the NIH really began investing in coronavirus vaccine technologies. And our work and a community of investigators noticed that the spike protein of the virus was the weak link in all of this, that it's really a soft target. And so we began developing prototype vaccines, began delivering different vaccines that presented spike protein to the immune system. And the reason I give you that brief history is because, one of the things that we're hearing about why people are hesitant to accept COVID-19 vaccines is because they say, how did this all happen in a couple of months? There must be something wrong. Well, in fact, it's a 17-year R&D program, so there's nothing rushed about it. 17 years is about the typical timeline of vaccine development, and I think it's important that the American people understand that point. And then I think the other piece to this is people that Operation Warp Speed name was a terrible name, a terrible branding, because again, that gave the impression that things are being rushed. It's not. I mean, the scientific rigor of Operation Warp Speed, the U.S. public-private partnership, is excellent, and the clinical trials are done with the highest integrity. These are large clinical trials, 30 to 60,000 people, depending on the vaccine, which is about a typical size of any vaccine program. The only part that we lopped off in terms of time, really, other than doing some of the manufacturing in parallel, is the fact that the emergency use authorization is coming out after 2-3 months of collecting safety and clinical trial data rather than the usual year period. And the reason for that is very simple. If we waited that whole extra year without having a national strategy in place, you do the math, 3,000 deaths a day times 365 days, the loss of human life would be staggering. So this is the reason for the emergency use authorization, is to carefully release vaccines to the public now, still continuing to monitor their safety and efficacy. And again, all of the vaccines work by the same principle. They're all work by eliciting what are called virus neutralizing antibodies to the spike protein. And then the scientific community just is not in full agreement what's the best way to do that. So we are at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital, we're pursuing an older technology, a recombinant protein vaccine that's similar to the hepatitis B vaccine that's been around for 40 years. And that's now being produced in India with 1.2 billion doses in collaboration with Biological E. And that's exciting for us because we've never made 1 billion of anything before. And that's being tested now across India in 5 sites. And so that's going to be in the mix, we hope. There's also, and then of course, the 2 mRNA vaccines, which are a newer technology from Pfizer and Moderna. And the reason why the mRNA vaccines are first is that even though it's a new technology, it only takes a day to make the mRNA. So it's a matter of just doing all the clinical testing and quality control. So we'll see the 2 mRNAs come out this month. Pfizer was out last week. I've already gotten my first dose of the Pfizer vaccine and happy to talk about how that went. And then the Mrna vaccine will come out, I think, tomorrow. We'll get the emergency use authorization. Then we'll have 2 of the adenovirus vectored vaccines from J&J and AstraZeneca Oxford. And then the Novavax particle vaccine, maybe our vaccine will be added. So we'll be looking at about 6 vaccines by the Q2 of 2021, I hope. And then the question I often get asked is, hey, doc, which vaccine are you going to wait for? And obviously I didn't. I took the first vaccine available. And that's the message. Don't try to overthink this. Don't try to game the system. Don't try to say, hey, maybe I'll take this vaccine or that vaccine. And the reason is, they all work the same way. They all work by inducing virus neutralizing antibodies to the spike protein. What we don't know is which of these vaccines is going to be the most durable in terms of length of protective immunity. Are these vaccines going to protect 3 months, 3 years, 30 years? There's no way to know that ahead of time. So, but the point is, go ahead and get vaccinated. And if it turns out the vaccine you got was not the one that was the most durable in protection, even after getting 2 doses, it's okay. You can get a 3rd dose of either the same vaccine as a booster or a different vaccine later on. That guidance will be forthcoming. But right now, given how what a dire public health situation we're in, the only thing that's guaranteed to keep you out of the ICU and the hospital is getting those virus neutralizing antibodies in your system through vaccination. And unfortunately, we still have a very high rate of vaccine hesitancy or vaccine refusal in this country. So the Kaiser Family Foundation just released the latest survey yesterday. And before I comment on the survey, let me just say there is some variation. So these surveys on vaccine compliance very much reflect the news cycle. So if they're taken on a day when there's well-publicized allergic reactions, then those numbers are going to go down. But we are seeing 2 consistent trends. So the Kaiser survey found, one, the vaccine hesitancy is highest among what they called Republicans. And part of that reflects we could talk about the history of the anti-vaccine movement and how that made this pivot to the political right under this banner that they call health freedom and medical freedom in 2015. So that partly reflects that. And then I'm very high among the African-American community. And so the way we're going to have, which we can also go into more detail, but I think the bottom line is as good as the Operation Warp Speed program is, one of its deficiencies was there was never a communication plan appended to it. It was mostly left, so there was a gap, there was a vacuum, and that gap was filled either by the pharma CEOs who were not strong communicators. And, we got a lot of mixed messages around stock dumping and trading and offline publicized phone calls to investors that created a loss of confidence. And then the other piece is we still fail to recognize there's a very aggressive anti-vaccine movement in the US. The US probably has it the worst right now, with more than 480 fake anti-vaccine websites all revved up on Facebook, social media, Twitter, Instagram. And so despite what you might be reading, that, you know, Facebook is doing this and that, the truth is they've done the minimum possible to show the optics of some level of corporate social responsibility. But I can go to my top 10 anti-vaccine sites and they're all there operating business as usual. And the Amazon site is very devastating. So if you go to put books up at the top on the Amazon site, as everyone has done, and press return, you get that scroll down menu to the left. If you go to the middle of the page, it says health, fitness, and dieting. You click on that, and then vaccinations. It's almost all fake anti-vaccine books and COVID conspiracy books. So we, as a nation, we have not had the appetite to really confront this very aggressive anti-vaccine lobby, and that's going to hurt us because, and this is my last comment, you know, the two things that we want a vaccine to do is, one, to keep us out of the hospital and the ICU. And I'm confident these vaccines will do that. But the second is that if enough Americans accept the vaccine, and if we get up to 75% vaccine coverage, that's a number that we came up with a group at City University in New York that we published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. Right now, we're not going to get there. Well, one, we're probably going to have to start vaccinating adolescents and kids, and we don't have the trial data yet. But the other is, unless we could do something about that vaccine refusal and compliance, we're not going to interrupt transmission of COVID-19 in the US, and we're going to have to find a way to deal with that. So I know I packed a lot of information there, and I'm happy to tease out any of that stuff or any other issues that people would like to address. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you, Doctor. And again, we are privileged to have you with us this morning. I know that your time is certainly being stretched further than you ever thought. One question that came up earlier in our conversation, can you, for those of us that are novices and we're really not well-versed in vaccines, can you give us some of the differences between the live vaccines and the killed vaccines? Can you talk on that a little bit?
Sure. So the only live vaccines that are in play right now are the two adenovirus vaccines. That is the AstraZeneca Oxford adenovirus vaccine and the J&J vaccine. And right now, those are not been released through emergency use authorization. They're still going through clinical trials. I think the J&J vaccine might get up in January or February, depending on how things go. And the advantage of the J&J one, that's maybe the only one that's a single dose vaccine, although we still don't know that for certain. And these are, what happens is these are recombinant adenovirus. So adenovirus is a DNA virus, but then they stick in the gene for the spike protein. So the virus is what's called a non-replicating virus. It does get taken up by the cells, but it doesn't really replicate as such, but it is still technically a live virus. There are other true live virus vaccines that are being developed by Merck and Company. One is using a VSV virus, the same that's used for the Ebola vaccine in Congo, and another a live measles recombinant virus. But those are not right now on the radar screen. Maybe at the end of this year, end of 2021, they may come up, but that's not really an option currently. So the mRNA vaccines are not live virus vaccines. It's an RNA is taken up by the cell, and in the cytoplasm of the cell, it's expressed as protein, and then that's delivered. Then the protein vaccines obviously are older generation technology vaccines.
How are you confident, Doctor, that the vaccines that are being developed, that we can be sure that they can't be tampered with? Or I know that's kind of a ballpark question, but are you confident about the security of our vaccines?
As far as I know, in terms of whether, there's going to be nefarious groups that try to do things. I suppose that's always possible. My understanding is the security around these vaccines has been pretty tight, certainly at the plants and at the FedEx and UPS facilities.
Mhm.
You know, after that, it goes to the states, and then then it becomes a state concern. And we have 50 states, and people are handling it differently. I think in terms of safety, you know, these are large clinical trials. 30 to 60,000 people, 44,000 for the Pfizer vaccine. And then the question is, well, is that a guarantee? And the answer is no. I mean, there still could be rare safety signals that didn't turn up in a 40,000 person trial that could turn up when you start vaccinating millions of Americans. That is a possibility. And that has happened before. That happened with one of the rotavirus vaccines, RotaShield. It looked really good in phase 3 trials, but then when you started vaccinating millions, cases of what's called intussusception popped up, where in little kids, the part of the intestine telescopes on top of the other, and that could be a life-threatening condition. But the good news was our monitoring systems, our post-licensure monitoring systems, such as VAERS and VSD and others, we have about 4 parallel systems in place, were robust enough to pick it up. And the manufacturer was notified. That was Wyeth, which is now, by the way, bought out by Pfizer. And Wyeth was notified, and they voluntarily withdrew the vaccine. So I think that was a good example of the fact that even after the vaccines are released, it's not like we just say adios and good luck. There's that very intensive monitoring system in place that's been fine-tuned over the years by the FDA and CDC.
And when it comes to children, Doctor, are you, and being a part of Texas Children's Hospital, are you confident that these vaccines will be safe for children as well?
Well, we're only starting the clinical trials now for the RNA vaccines, and I guess the adenovirus vaccines will follow. So we don't know the answer to that, but that's being addressed. I don't see an obvious reason why it would be a problem in kids compared to adults, but you know, we'll collect that data. And just for disclosure on this one, I have a bit of a conflict because I do have a horse in the race on this one, a recombinant protein vaccine. And I like to think our recombinant protein vaccine, because it uses a technology that's been given to kids for decades, might be well suited to be a pediatric vaccine if we could find a way to bring it into the US. But that's just a kind of an interesting side point. So all these vaccines are going to be studied in kids. You know, right now the Pfizer vaccine is approved for kids over the age of 16 and up, and then Moderna 18 and up. And I think what you'll see right now underway are step-down studies looking at the vaccine in adolescents. And I think that's an important population to study, because if you go to pediatric intensive care units across the country in children's hospitals, you will see adolescents in ICUs with COVID-19, particularly those that have diabetes or obesity and underlying chronic illness. So vaccinating those kids would certainly be beneficial. And then this gets to, what do the schools look like in the fall? I think, you know, as we, a year from now, you know, looking at next end of August, September, when most schools, you know, we hope will be open, hopefully we'll have teachers, school staff, bus drivers, parents vaccinated, and then also start vaccinating the kids. So if we can get those trials up and running and show the vaccines are safe and effective in time for the fall school year, that would be a great time to have the kids vaccinated if parents want their kids vaccinated.
And is that kind of a target for your vaccine as well, or do you have a timetable for yours?
Well, right now, we're mainly focusing on low and middle income countries for vaccinating, because I'm really worried about, you know, Latin America is getting hit really hard, of course, and we're worried about Africa. And it doesn't look like the mRNA vaccines are going to have that much of a role for this pandemic in low and middle income countries. The Mrna vaccine is quite expensive. The Pfizer vaccine has that onerous minus 100-degree freezer requirement. It's not necessarily a showstopper, but it's going to be more daunting. So then and now the Sanofi vaccine has been delayed. The Queensland vaccine has been delayed, so the choices are running out. We'll have the two adenovirus vaccines from J&J and AstraZeneca Oxford. There are the Russian and Chinese vaccines of uncertain quality. And then there's our vaccine. The thing I worry about the Russians and the Chinese, they are now in discussions with WHO, World Health Organization, for pre-qualification. But in the meantime, I'm very troubled by the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are going behind everyone and are doing one-off negotiations with the individual countries. So there are these bilateral agreements to supply vaccines of unknown quality. And I don't know, it just makes me uneasy. It has that kind of Cold War feel or smell to it, using influence to get those vaccines into the Latin American and African countries. So we've had a bit of an unraveling of the global governance of our vaccines, hopefully with the U.S. Rejoining the World Health Organization, as the Biden administration said they're going to do, and joining the COVAX facility, which is the big international facility for trying to provide some equitable sharing. I think that will help. But in the meantime, I worry about that sort of Cold War style influence that we're seeing.
Definitely. I know we have questions from our participants, but before we get there, Doctor, if I can, what advice do you have for those of us that are policymakers, and how we can continue to have the people and the equipment and the facilities necessary for developing these vaccines that not only do we need them today, but we will certainly in the future as well?
Well, that's a great question. Beyond the physical nuts and bolts and personnel, I think a key component that's just not been there is communication. We've not had, if you remember what Andrew Cuomo did back in March and April, he was out there every day explaining what was going on with the epidemic in New York, and I think that kind of honest discussion was very helpful for the American people. We don't have that right now. We don't have voices out there that are explaining all of this and which vaccine should I take? Why is this safe? What do I do if I'm pregnant? What if I do if my wife's on Humira and immunocompromised? And we're just not getting that kind of regular discussion. So I think opening channels of communication, particularly for the African American community where the vaccine acceptance is really poor, bringing out leaders in the African American community and to advocate for vaccines is going to be important. And then, especially worry about that very high rate of vaccine refusal, particularly in the middle part of the country where there's still a lot of people who still think COVID-19 is a hoax, or the COVID deaths are actually due to other causes other than COVID, or, these fake concepts of herd immunity, and, all that's got to be reined in also. So I think, the one piece that I see missing is that regular level of communication. And one of the things that I'm doing, when I saw the numbers coming out about the high rates of vaccine refusal among conservative groups, especially being here in Texas, I thought this was a great advantage to really reach out to conservative news outlets. So I've been trying to speak as much as I can on Fox News and you name it, the Daily Caller. I'll talk. I'm talking to Breitbart. I'll talk to any conservative news site. It sort of breaks my heart. I haven't spent a lot of time in the Midwest. Most of my time has been spent. I visit a lot of the big universities across the Midwest, and as I always say, they're the nicest group of people you could ever hope to meet, right? They'll give you the shirt off their back, and to see this level of suffering and death from COVID-19, for me, is really heartbreaking. So I'm just doing all I can to get the word out.
Thank you. And Carolyn, have you got some questions?
Yeah, I have a question from Senator Lee, and this is one I'm sure will bother you. It says that a constituent told him this morning that they had a conversation with a person who does not think they'll get the vaccine because it's made from aborted fetal tissue, or aborted fetal tissue was used in the development. No matter what the constituent said in response, there was no moving that position. So how does a legislator respond to a constituent that says that?
So here's the deal on that. So it's not relevant to the 2 mRNA vaccines, but the 2 adenovirus vaccines, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine and the J&J vaccine, those viruses are propagated on cells in the cells that replicate in the test tube, and that's how you have to propagate viruses, because the viruses depend on living inside cells. So those cells are, I believe, are called HEK cells. It came from the kidney of one aborted fetus back in the 1970s. So the point is that some of that tissue, it was I believe it was a voluntary abortion. That tissue came from the kidney and then has been replicated for the last 50 years. So first of all, there is nothing left anymore of that aborted fetus, right? There's no tissue left from that aborted fetus. These are cells that have been propagated in the trillions since the 1970s. And, the Catholic Church has weighed in on, and there are not many vaccines that have that. The varicella vaccine, the chickenpox vaccine, similar story. The rubella vaccine to prevent congenital rubella syndrome. And I think one of the hepatitis A vaccine. So for instance, the Catholic Church has weighed in on this. Not related specifically to COVID-19, but years ago they weighed in and say, look, these are life-saving vaccines, and the church basically endorsed, at least the Vatican has endorsed, you go ahead and using those vaccines. So it's not coming from an aborted fetus, it's a cell line that was derived from kidneys, 50, 60 years ago. And I think when you make that point, it gets people to understand it a little bit better.
Okay,
but remember how this works. You have the anti-vaccine groups, saying this in a way that's as exploitative as possible. And so they take that little kernel of something and it gets blown up into something else.
Senator Lee had some other questions on animal research, but we'll hold those. I think we have, Laura, can you unmute Rachel? She has some questions. Rachel Ganani from Minnesota. You have a question for the doctor?
I'm sorry, I don't. I must have raised my hand accidentally.
Oh, okay. All right. That's great. All right, Noreen, then there's another question on and you touched on it, Dr. Hotez, on the storage needs. Do you think that these storage needs of the mRNA are going to impact how rural America can get this vaccine, because we don't really have those facilities?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, one of the biggest problems is that the first vaccine out the door is also logistically the most complicated because of that deep minus 100-degree freezer requirement. I don't know how, but the way I gotten my adult vaccines, the Shingrix vaccine and my flu vaccine, is I go to we have a big supermarket chain here in Texas called HEB, and I go to the pharmacy at HEB and I get my vaccine. That's going to be hard to do for this Pfizer vaccine because of that minus 100-degree freezer requirement. So, on the one hand, it's unfortunate that the first one out is the most logistically complicated. On the other hand, you can argue if we can get it right with this one, then it makes the other ones seem a lot easier because they don't have that same onerous requirement. So the Mrna vaccine, which is also an RNA vaccine, also requires freezing temperatures, but not the minus 100 degrees. It could be done at the same freezer temperatures as in any household freezer, and you could store it in refrigerated temperatures for a month. So I think that one can certainly get into local pharmacy chains, Walgreens and CVS. I think that one won't be a problem. And then all the other ones are simple refrigerator requirements. So, but the first one is no question the toughest. And you're right. I was on MSNBC with Ali Velshi, and he was broadcasting from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation out in South Dakota, which is pretty remote. And when you're looking at that, how do you manage that Pfizer vaccine? It's going to be really tough. So no question, that's going to be difficult. The good news about Operation Warp Speed is they created quite a portfolio, so we're not just dependent on that one.
And that brings up a question from Lena Taylor, Wisconsin legislator. She's concerned about how are we going to reach some of these communities particularly communities of color, that that may have hesitations about it? Do you have suggestions, or is there some outreach? Is there outreach efforts or funding, or what suggestions do you have to reach these communities that may be hesitant about it?
So all I know for certain is that the federal government is planning a series of public service announcements, PSAs. I don't think that's going to be adequate. I think we're going to, need leaders from the African American community out there, especially at the local level, especially clergy members. I'm doing as many African American radio stations as I can to talk about it. I think the other piece you have to remember is these anti-vaccine guys are not nice people. They actually they specifically target groups. So those of you in Minnesota might remember the measles epidemic among the Somali immigrant community in the Twin Cities in 2017. That didn't happen by accident. They were specifically targeted by the leaders of the anti-vaccine groups who held town hall meetings, robocalls, and told them that vaccines cause autism, which is absolutely not true. And the reason I know it's not true, I have a daughter with autism, and I really looked at this in detail. I wrote a book called Vaccines Do Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which may be the #1 target of the anti-vaccine groups. They now call me the OG villain, which I had to look up. It means the original gangster villain. So you're hearing from the original gangster villain today. And then they generated that measles epidemic, landed 21 kids in the hospital in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And then they did it again with the Orthodox Jewish community in New York. They targeted them, and again, with very inflammatory language around the Holocaust, comparing vaccines to the Holocaust. And now they're doing it again. They staged rallies in Harlem at the end of last year and beginning of this year, calling, and you know what they did? They called vaccines the next Tuskegee experiment. So again, it's not only, there's a lot of pieces to this. There's the historic racism, structural racism. There's the fact that we have so few Black physicians and healthcare providers, especially male African-American physicians. We just don't have enough. And then you have that specific targeting by the anti-vaccine group. So it's going to be tough, particularly because if you look at the deaths from COVID-19, whereas among non-Hispanic white populations under the age of 65, it's only 13%. For the Black and Hispanic communities, Native American communities is 35% under the age of 65. So, reaching minority groups in their 40s, 50s, and early 60s, that's got to be a priority.
Okay, and we have MPP Bisson, you have a question. If you'll unmute yourself, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's Bisson, it's a French name.
Bisson, sorry.
Not a problem. Listen, my question is, I've had a couple of constituents approach me in regards to they're on chemotherapy or immune suppressed, and they're hearing that these particular vaccines are not going to be, they're not going to be able to take them. Is there any truth to that?
So for the mRNA vaccines, which are again not live virus vaccines, so I don't see an obvious reason why they couldn't take it. The only absolute contraindication from the FDA is not to give it to people with known allergies to vaccinations, or if they're known to be allergic to any of the ingredients in the vaccine. So that would not include those groups. So they should be able to get it. I think the problem is that it's just not well studied. So that so I think what's going to happen is those individuals will have to consult their physicians and make a decision on a case-by-case basis, because it's all about risk versus benefit. So even though there's not a lot known about these vaccines in immunocompromised patients, there's also that high risk of what happens if they get COVID-19. And there's such a screaming level of transmission right now that, that you may make the decision that the benefits of getting vaccinations outweigh the risks.
As MPP West gets ready for his question, I want to say Senator Schwank from Pennsylvania wants to know if the COVID vaccine should be mandatory for children in the future.
Yeah, I get asked a lot about vaccine mandates. I even get asked about actually paying people to get vaccinated. I don't think we need to go there, at least right now. Right now, we don't have enough vaccine to go around, and we don't know for certain which vaccines they're going to get up. So, mandating vaccines, I think, is going to be pointless at this point. I'm hoping, being the optimist that I am, that as the American people start seeing their friends and colleagues and family members get vaccinated without untoward effects, that everyone eventually will want to take the vaccine. And that enough parents will want to see their kids vaccinated, that we won't need those vaccine mandates. I think what you're starting to see now is the anti-vaccine groups through this health freedom, medical freedom movement are creating the straw man saying, you're not going to force us to get vaccines. No one's forcing anybody at this point. So I would hold off on it, let this kind of evolve naturally. And let's see what vaccines we have by the summer, and then make decisions. Because again, if you look at the schools, the greatest risk, of course, is to the teachers, the staff, the bus drivers, and the parents when the kids come home. And if they're vaccinated, then that risk goes down. But we still do see serious illness in kids, and so I think parents may feel that it's important to vaccinate their kids if they feel comfortable about the technology, and that's an unknown as well. So I don't think we have to go in the mandate direction, at least for now, and let's see how this evolves naturally.
And that brings up Representative Eisenhardt's question. What is your timeline? What is the best case scenario, do you think, that we will have enough people vaccinated, Doctor?
Well, remember, right now people are getting vaccinated, and so by the spring, I think life will be better because there'll be a high percentage of adults vaccinated, and they'll have that security that they're not going to wind up in a hospital or intensive care unit the next day. So I think that in itself will be important in terms of interrupting transmission of the virus. So we don't need social distancing or masks anymore, maybe by the fall, but there's still going to be a far better quality of life in the coming months. And that's why I say, let's do what we can to social distance, wear masks, prevent those surges on the intensive care units, because that's when we know mortality rates really go up, and get everybody to the other side to get vaccinated. And life is definitely going to improve. So even if, I can't say that we're going to halt COVID-19 transmission now, we'll still be in a much better position in terms of our quality of life.
Okay, last question, MPP West.
Yeah, two quick ones. One, you talked briefly about the anti-vax movement, and I'm wondering where we can get information to sort of combat what's going out there, because more and more people who I would think of as reasonable are asking questions about this and speculating about, how this is a government conspiracy and things like that. The other one is, I'm wondering if you're concerned that as the vaccine releases or is rolled out, if there will be people who will stop wearing masks, stop socially distancing, who haven't been vaccinated, just saying, well, I am vaccinated, so you don't have to worry about me.
Yeah, I think these are big issues. And the anti-vaccine movement is dominating the internet. There's the book that I wrote called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which I wrote in 2018. And now you can get it in paperback. But there's also some good information on the vaccines.gov, which is the federal government site. There's the CDC site. The CDC site's got a lot of information. The problem with the CDC site is I know where to look for it, but I have an MD and a PhD, and I know where to look for it. It's not always as user-friendly for lay people that are trying to get better. There's Vaccinate Your Family. That's a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. There's the Vaccine Education Center of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. There's this great site called Vaxipedia that's got a lot of good information as well. And by the way, if anybody has a question, wants to email me, my email is just last name Hotez, Hotez, at BCM. It stands for Baylor College of Medicine.edu. Hotez at bcm.edu. Usually I'm known for how rapidly I respond to emails. That used to be the case. I'm not quite as quick on the draw lately, but because of all the craziness, but yeah, if there's something I can be helpful with, feel free to do that. But we are going to have to figure out a way to mount that counteroffensive. And then you're right. I mean, and part of the problem is the anti-vaccine groups keep on moving the goalposts. So you think you have your arms around their major assertions, we've counteracted, and they'll come up with something new. The latest one is we're creating genetically modified humans through the mRNA vaccine. And the crazier the conspiracy is, the more it seems to catch hold. I mean, I can't tell you how many people think that me and Bill Gates and Tony Fauci have a secret lab in Area 51 where we're making viruses and things. But there it is. Yeah, so it is tough to keep ahead of it. And just remember, if you hear something that sounds crazy, it probably is, and it's coming from what's an organized disinformation empire. The other piece to this is we now know from British and US intelligence that the Russians are really piling on anti-vaccine misinformation on the internet and social media and these bots and trolls. And there's even a term for it now called weaponized health communication. And then, you start having to be careful how you say all this. If you start talking about the Russians and links to far right-wing extremist groups, you yourself start sounding like a conspiracy theorist and something like someone who throws things at the TV at night. So trying to explain all this to audiences is not easy.
Robin, Martin, you have one last question for him?
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Hotez, thank you for your presentation. It's been very informative. And I guess one thing I was wondering about was way back when we were talking about natural immunity for people who had COVID and recovered. I was looking at articles, the research, and trying to understand it. I'm not a medical professional by background, just a lawyer, but I was looking at those articles and trying to follow. And what I read was that most people were thinking that immunity might last 6 months. And so I'm just wondering what the latest research shows about immunity and whether those numbers would be comparable for natural immunity and immunity from the mRNA vaccine.
So it's more we don't know than we do know about this. So when the original SARS came out in 2003, the one that hit Toronto, the study showed that people who tended to get very sick and they had long-lasting antibodies for years, more than a decade. So people assume that COVID-19 would go by the same playbook, but it seems that the level of antibodies is much lower in individuals who are asymptomatic, and they seem to decline, or with low-grade symptoms, and they seem to decline very quickly. Now, the problem is we don't really know what it means when antibodies decline quickly, because you still have something called memory B cells and T cells. So the reason people say that immunity only lasts 5 to 6 months is because the antibodies are no longer detectable. But in fact, if you look at the work of people like Akiko Iwasaki at Yale, she showed that there's still those memory B cells and T cells, and they may in fact have some immunity. The bottom line is this: I think there's no downside to vaccinating someone with previous infection. In fact, now that we have 1 million new cases a day in the US, right now we're probably vaccinating lots of people with previous infection and don't even realize it. And it's too hard to operationalize measuring antibodies first and then vaccinating. So the point is, if you've had previous infection, go ahead and get vaccinated. I don't see a downside. You may get a boost because you've been sort of primed already. You may even get a big boost just by the first dose of getting the vaccine. So the point is, if you've had previous infection, I think you should still be vaccinated.
We want to thank you so much, and if you can stay on for a few more minutes, we want to hear about how this research got to your point, and that is with animal research. And so, Representative Anderson, you're going to go ahead and get some information here from Matt Bailey on how this wouldn't happen if we didn't do the animal research first.
Well, Dan, yeah, thank you, Dr. Hotez. Your information is just so interesting and timely, and thanks for taking the time to visit with us this morning. We're going to switch gears a little bit, talk to Matt Bailey, again, president of the Foundation of Biomedical Research. And Matt, can you talk about the role of animal research in the development of vaccines, and in particular in the development of this extremely fast-paced development of vaccines for COVID-19?
Yes, thank you for having me. I run a couple of small nonprofits in Washington, D.C., an association and a foundation. We're an advocacy group to sort of counteract some of the narrative that typically comes from animal rights groups when it comes to basic research and drug development. Our opponents to animal research tend to operate in very similar fashion to anti-vax groups. So I'm hearing a lot of uptick in the anti-vaccine community. There's also been a pretty significant uptick in animal rights groups alleging that we don't need to use animals in research anymore, and nothing could be further from the truth. You know, animal research really is a critical component of efforts to fight disease of all kinds, and COVID-19 is just a prime example of why it's so important. You know, I could spend a lot of time talking about all the species, but here's just a few. African green monkeys, anteaters, bats, camels, cats, chickens, dogs, cows, ferrets, flies, guinea pigs, hamsters, horseshoe crabs, llamas, rhesus macaque monkeys, genetically engineered mice, mink, pigs, rats, and even snakes are all being studied to help better understand this disease. Research in rodents like genetically modified mice, hamsters, rats, and minks have helped researchers understand how the coronavirus attacks our bodies and for testing new drugs and therapies for treating disease it causes. Non-human primates, I don't want to underestimate that species. Well, more than one species that we call non-human primates, rhesus macaques being one, cynomolgus monkeys being another. You know, they've played a big role in what we've seen come out to date. And, you know, part of the reason for that is primates in particular share more DNA with humans than other species. Rhesus macaques share about 93% DNA with humans. So it makes sense to investigate the impact of experimental drugs and vaccines in non-human primates. If you look at some of what has been used to treat COVID, remdesivir, I'm sure everybody's heard about this one, an antiviral. You know, sort of the first FDA-approved COVID treatment, and that was done initially with research in mice and macaque monkeys. Or if you look at Regeneron's drug, a cocktail of monoclonal antibodies, you know, that was developed earlier this year with genetically engineered mice. And then it later went through testing in hamsters and several types of non-human primates before making its way into human trials. The vaccines that have, the one that's been approved with Pfizer and BioNTech, the Mrna Vaccine, the AstraZeneca, University of Oxford, and the Novavax vaccines have all had success in non-human primate studies and required mouse model studies as part of their development. So the notion from some in the public that we simply don't need animals anymore for research and testing purposes is absolutely false. And that not only goes for treatments for humans, but it also goes for treatments for animals themselves, our pets. And, you know, I think one of the big arguments that we hear from opponents to animal research is, well, you can just do this with a computer model. And computer modeling certainly has its place in research, but one example I like to use is, you may or may not be aware, but in Boulder, Colorado, the National Weather Service has entire buildings full of supercomputers daisy-chained together to help us predict the weather. And you know how well that goes. Computers really are only as good as the information you put into them for the most part. Now, artificial intelligence is probably going to bring a new layer, but for basic research, I think researchers need to understand something first before they can put it into a computer and do further work with it. Our bodies are incredibly complex, and frankly, there's a lot that researchers still don't understand, thus the term basic research. You'll hear arguments from opponents that you know, this work can all be done on tissue chips and organoids, and those are really fantastic technological achievements. But I was listening to a young researcher sort of describe some of their limitations, and he said, I thought he put this quite well, that these organs on a chip tend to provide a pretty one-dimensional view of everything that happens in somebody's body. And he said, last time I checked, we're not all flat Stanleys. So you need to have a full view of everything that can happen in your body when you ingest a new chemical compound or when you have a vaccine. And the precursor to that absolutely is animal models. You know, it should be common sense. Everybody should understand why new compounds and vaccines are tested in animals first, but you'd be surprised how many people in the public just don't understand it. I think our memories are short. There's 0.3, I believe, of the Nuremberg Code exists for a reason. In World War II, some of the atrocities of Nazi Germany, where humans were tested on first, resulted in the Nuremberg Code saying if you have a new chemical compound, you need to try this in an animal first. Of course, the Tuskegee studies are a perfect example of that too. Again, you'd think this would be common knowledge and common sense, but it's not. Our polling shows that 20 years ago, we had a 70% approval rating by the public for animal testing. Today, we're running at about 50%. About half the public doesn't support this. So animals, bottom line, are absolutely critical to the kind of work that Dr. Hotez and others are doing.
Matt, can our pets and other animals be infected with COVID-19? And if they can, is there going to be a vaccine to give to our animals in the future?
Yes, perhaps not all your pets, depending on your pets, but we do know now that both cats and dogs can get COVID-19, this one in particular. I just read an article a day or two ago that suggested there was a group of Israeli researchers who were looking at feral cats in Latvia. And what they discovered was for every cat they were able to round up, almost all of them showed antibodies for COVID. And the other thing they observed was that cats in particular seem to recover much more quickly than humans. So I think that's something that's worth studying and looking into to understand the mechanism. What's different about cats than humans that allows them to recover more quickly? There is a company in South Dakota, I believe, called MedGene Labs that has now developed a vaccine for companion animals. And it looks like they've got some pretty promising preclinical study results. So, you know, they're saying we've observed that cats, ferrets, and mink all have shown to be susceptible to the disease. There hasn't been very clear transmission from humans to cats, and they haven't seen a lot of transmission from cats back to humans. But they, on the other hand, have seen that a little bit with mink. And this company is suggesting that their vaccine could be ready for pets in possibly early to middle of next year.
Oh, I need to slip in one question here from Doug Lamont for Dr. Hotez, because I know he has a hard out at 10. We can go on with some other questions, but Mr. Lamont, you have a question for Dr. Hotez?
Yeah, sorry, I'll just unmute. I just was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the effects on, you were saying the serious consequences for young people and children, or serious cases in young people and children. Where we are, we still have our schools open. We have had very high cases, and there's been sort of this attitude that young people can't be affected or are safer. So I was just wondering if you could talk about what you've seen or what the impacts have been for serious cases in young people and children.
Yeah, you make up a good point. I think overall, kids seem to do better with this virus than adults, and for reasons that we still don't understand. Is it because of other upper respiratory coronaviruses that are out there are protecting them? We really don't know. So that's a bit of a medical mystery. The two groups that I've seen with serious illness are the adolescents with underlying comorbidities, as I say, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, renal disease. So if you go into pediatric ICUs, you will see patients like that. And then the others are, there's this relatively rare syndrome called pediatric multisystem inflammatory disorder or syndrome. And it's a pretty severe disease that somewhat resembles a condition that we would see when I was doing a lot of pediatric infectious disease consultations called Kawasaki's illness. And it's an overwhelming stimulation of all the inflammatory pathways that could be associated with low blood pressure, rash, organ dysfunction. And they saw quite a bit of it in New York City when they had the horrible epidemic in March and April. As far as I know, there's no way to predict which kids might get that. And it's not only kids, adults can get it too. So we've seen it. It's uncommon, fortunately, but it's still there. And there is therefore, besides preventing transmission to adults, it's another reason why if we really should think about vaccinating kids. So I don't know, where are you based?
Manitoba.
Manitoba, yeah. So I don't know if, the big children's hospital there in Winnipeg, I don't know if they're seeing cases or not, or asking for there was a 10-year-old child who died. But yeah. So fortunately it's rare, but it's still there.
Are you a Habs fan?
Well, it's actually a great story. My grandfather and his family grew up in the Marais, in the Jewish quarter of Paris, and he got out before the Nazis went to Montreal, but his half sister went to Winnipeg. So I have family in Winnipeg also, and
I'm probably an in-law. Okay, thank you very much.
It's a small world.
So I always tell people that Canada rescued my family, and the reason I'm here is because of the good people of Canada.
We thank Canada tremendously.
Thank
know
you.
you have a heart out. You've probably got another interview, Dr. Hotez, and on behalf of everybody on both committees and legislators across the country, we really thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know how hard your jobs are. I can't imagine anything more difficult than being in public service at this horrible, horrible time. So thank you for your service. And as I say, if there's anything that I can do to provide information or help, feel free to email me, and happy to help in any way I can.
Thank you, Doctor.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Paul, back to you and Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Matt, you mentioned mink, and we're hearing reports that in Denmark, they've had to put down a large number of mink. We have mink in this country. Is that something we need to be concerned about?
Yeah, absolutely. I read that story, saw that when it happened, and personally, I think, wiping out the entire mink population in Denmark was a mistake, just my opinion. I understand in that case the disease had mutated and posed a risk to the population there, but it also represented an opportunity to further study the disease in an effort to save mink and to add to the overall body of scientific knowledge about this disease. Researchers need as much information as they can possibly get, and history shows that serendipity plays a huge role in research as well. I mean, how many times have researchers found life-altering new data when initially looking for something completely different? The other reason I think you need to be thinking about this is the USDA just reported that they have found a COVID case in a wild mink, which means that the disease is spreading in the mink population in the US. So pay attention. It's affecting many species, and mink are in the mix for sure.
Okay, thank you. We all, or most of us, work in the arena of public policy, Matt. And do you know of any legislation out there, state legislation, that will have the potential to impact the research you are doing, and how that impacts research into vaccines and in your animal research?
I do. I don't want to go into great detail because there's, quite frankly, so much of it. On the federal level in Congress, we've had to fight probably 40 bills this year alone that would negatively affect people like Dr. Hotez and their work and their ability to continue mainly using animals in research. Science is often misunderstood by the public and policymakers alike. I can't think of very many PhD policymakers. In general, I think that a hands-off approach is best when it comes to researchers. In the interest of public health and for the sake of all the animals we love, just don't pass laws that are going to handcuff researchers. But despite my best wishes, I know that you all will be asked to introduce or support legislation that would, on its surface, initially appear to be in the interest of animal welfare. But oftentimes there are unintended consequences to these policy proposals that really would negatively affect research at your local university, your local biotech company, or a pharma company. And I would just encourage lawmakers to first check with us to get a read on a bill before moving forward.
Matt, thank you. Those are good words to take into consideration, especially in this time now that we're learning that the research and development is so critical to the well-being of all of us in this country and really around the world as well. Any more questions, Carolyn, or can we move on?
I'm looking to see if anybody, I'm checking the things.
Okay.
No, you can go move on. If you have questions, please go ahead and put them up in the chat or raise your hand and we'll go ahead and put you on. So if there's any other comments for you and Matt, we'll play it by ear, whatever you all tell me.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. Really a learning experience to learn of the importance of research and animal research in this area. And hang around for a while if you would, please. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Representative Jennifer Schultz of Minnesota. And you can work with your area of expertise.
No, Senator Jenner, she had an emergency Zoom call and had to leave, Paul. So it's all up to you and Noreen.
Okay.
Is there any, or if there's no additional questions, I don't see any. Does anybody have any additional questions? You want to raise your hand or unmute yourself? Or questions that if we didn't get covered, we can go back and ask Dr. Hotez too. Anybody have any additional questions on things?
Matt, I would ask, why mink? Why the outbreak in the mink?
Well, it's not just mink, it's many species. So this is a very interesting virus. And the frightening thing to me is that it is not only, it can not only be transmitted to animals and from animals back to humans, but it also mutates in that process. And every time COVID mutates, it presents another challenge for researchers. So what we don't know is, how transmissible will it be when mink contract the disease? How transmissible will it be back to humans, or will it? We simply don't know. And as it has mutated, if it comes back to humans from mink, will that mean that it's mutated enough that the current vaccines are not effective? Now, one thing is clear to me is that this is not going to be the last major event. I'm not saying that just to scare everybody, but it's just kind of the nature of the beast.
Right.
These diseases that transmit from humans to animals and animals back to humans are called zoonoses. And it really underscores the importance of not only animals being in the process for researchers, but of the close working relationship between PhD, MDs like Dr. Hotez and veterinarians. This is a concept that is often referred to as One Health. And we just see the overlap time and time again. It goes both ways. Just a very practical example I use on Capitol Hill a lot, just because it's easy to understand, is, hip replacements. It's not an infectious disease issue, but doctors wouldn't know how to do a human hip replacement if it wasn't for hip dysplasia in large breeds like German Shepherds. That technique was perfected in animals in a veterinary setting before it went to humans. And conversely, modern cancer treatments for your pets were perfected in humans before they went to your pet. So it's a symbiotic relationship that really takes all of us. And I would just encourage you to remember that phrase, One Health.
Matt, you talked about mutations. I hear a lot of people talk about even prior to March. So back last December, they had something. They couldn't really put their finger on it, didn't really know what it was. They were really ill. Do you believe that that could have been a mutation of what we now know to be COVID-19?
Well, just to give a disclaimer here, I'm not a research scientist. I'm a public policy and public relations guy, so I'm not really qualified to say scientifically on that point. I will say anecdotally, I've heard very similar things. In fact, I experienced something quite similar myself. Before we really knew about COVID, I had something pretty awful, and it wasn't a typical flu. So there may be some merit to that. You know, I think in terms of messaging on this issue, research scientists aren't really talking a lot about possible mutations. And I think, you know, part of that may be because they don't completely understand it yet. And part of it may be because our public has been through a lot and they don't want to, you know, strike fear into everybody. But I personally think it's a real possibility.
Thank you.
Matthew, a quick question I have. Talked about the mink situation, and then thinking in terms of our meat production, the hogs, cattle, sheep, goats, that type of thing. Any evidence of it being transferred back and forth between those different species of animals?
Well, we've certainly seen evidence of pigs, goats, sheep, cattle being able to get the disease. What we haven't seen is any real evidence of those animals transmitting the disease back to humans. I know there's a lot of concern with people, you know, ingesting the meat of an animal. Is that going to give me COVID? Frankly, we just don't have a lot of evidence of that happening to this point. A little bit that I've seen about the survivability of this virus. You know, I think it was work done by the NIH at their Rocky Mountain labs. They demonstrated that the virus can stay alive for quite a long period of time, even on a cardboard surface. The virus doesn't seem to like cold for some reason. Well, actually, that's the reverse. The virus can survive in cold. They demonstrated it can survive in sort of a freezing environment. It doesn't like heat. And so the working theory that I've heard is that meats that are cooked and prepared normally in a high temperature is probably going to kill the virus. So you really don't have to worry about transmission through food for the most part.
And that's a problem, Matthew, because we're already hearing some countries that are testing incoming food shipments for the virus and preventing, and I don't know if that's a real issue or if it's just a trade issue, but that's obviously something that we're going to be dealing with for the next year or so, is that if they locate the virus on a surface of an incoming shipment, they're canceling the shipment. And that's going to be something that's going to impact us tremendously. And I know it's China, and that's kind of, there's all kinds of problems there, but it still impacts our trade. So, are there any other questions from anybody? If not, we'll let Paul and Noreen take us home. And we'll make sure that in the recording and also on the website will be all the contact information for both Matthew Bailey and the Dr. Hotez, and so that you can contact them with additional questions. And we also have some resources that Laura will put a slide up now for some additional resources.
Noreen, thank you. This has been a very interesting get together and meeting, a lot of questions asked, and thank you for hosting it. And any final words?
I want to thank you, Paul, and again, all the at CSG, and Matthew, thank you for sharing all that information with us, and Dr. Hotez. I think we have had some really great information shared with us today, and I think it's terrific. So thank you all for joining at what for some could be an early hour.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all.